Welcome to the latest in our Ince series of Back to Work webinars, where we try to offer our help to help your businesses get back up and running. I'm Alan Barnett. I'm a partner at Ince and lead the hospitality and leisure team. In these most challenging of times, the hospitality sector has been more acutely impacted than most by the effect of government guidance to halt the spread of COVID-19. We know from the conversations that we're having with our clients that some hospitality businesses have found they've been better placed to deal with the pandemic, such as long stay or apart hotels, whilst others have been able to adapt to mitigate the worst effect of the shutdown, perhaps by catering for key workers or switching to a delivery model of business. In the main, however, the economic impact has been severe. It was therefore with some relief that the sector in the UK greeted the government decision to allow hotels to provide accommodation and restaurants to open their premises from the 4th of July. What faces operators, however, is a complex web of new guidance and advice, as our clients from across the industry battle to understand and deal with the new trading environment. So we're seeing certain common questions and themes emerge from what are often quite different businesses. I'm very pleased, therefore, to be able to introduce my partners, Laura Livingstone and Rebecca Lynch. Laura heads our employment team here in London, and together they will consider some of the common challenges that they're seeing from an HR perspective and offer what we hope are some pragmatic suggestions for managing staff in this most unsettling time. Thank you.
Hello everyone. In today's webinar, I'm delighted to be talking to Laura Livingstone, our Head of Employment at Ince. Ordinarily, Laura would be talking to me from our Aldgate East office, but today, of course, she's talking to me from home. In relation to the COVID-19 crisis, Laura and the employment team have moved from primarily advising on the furlough scheme and how to utilise this, to now advising clients on how to ensure that their workforce can safely return following the relaxation of the lockdown regime in the UK. And in particular, they're dealing with a variety of queries regarding members of the workforce who are worried about returning, or in some cases are actually refusing to do so. Today, we're going to cover some of the queries that the team have been dealing with and draw on their real world experience, obviously on a no names basis, and look at how they tackle these in the context of the hospitality industry, which, as Alan has said, has been one of the most badly affected by the crisis. So Laura, let's dive straight into some of the tricky issues that you and the team have been dealing with. First, if a member of staff was to refuse to come into work, can the employer insist that they do so, assuming, of course, that they're not displaying any symptoms of COVID-19 and they're not classified as vulnerable?
Yes, well, the starting point is whether the employee really has a reasonable belief that they're in serious and imminent danger. And in order to basically satisfy the fact that, or to deny this thought, employers need to comply with government guidance, take all reasonable measures to prevent the transmission of infection, and also consider, importantly, a person's individual circumstances, their own vulnerability or whether they have vulnerable people in their home. And this means meeting with them remotely if needed and exploring ways as to why they're concerned about returning to work.
Okay, so assuming you've done all of that and you're satisfied as the employer that the employee can safely return to work, and you perhaps think that their stance is unreasonable, can you insist that they do so?
Well, although an employer can argue that they've provided a secure workplace in line completely with government guidance, and they've done all they can to protect themselves, they think, from a claim, unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as that. And the reason for that is that this is a scary virus, and so some people are going to feel very differently about it to others. And if someone's refusing, you'll need to consult with them and work out whether any of their job could be perhaps done from home, and if not, whether there's somewhere in your premises which can be said to be more isolated, say, from everyone else. And if this isn't possible, then you'll need to consider altering working hours and days so that that person might not be perhaps as exposed to so many people in the workplace.
Okay, but what about an employee who's in a client-facing role that requires them to be on the employer's premises?
Well, in this situation, you might have to go above and beyond government guidelines to reassure those scared members of staff about the safety when they're on shift or when they're in work. And this might involve more stringent, say, cleaning regimes, more regular changing of face masks, strict social distancing, and other measures to avoid too much contact with members of the public or other members of staff.
Okay, but if that's still not deemed to be enough by the employee, do you then have to consider disciplinary action to try and force them back into the workplace?
Well, we're finding the majority of staff, fortunately, are happy to return to work, provided that reasonable measures are being taken in line with government guidelines. But I have also encountered that there are a number of stragglers, and I'd recommend that you ask these members of staff to take holiday first, or unpaid leave perhaps, before considering whether to go down a disciplinary route. If these staff were on furlough before the magic date of the 30th of June, then consider whether to furlough them again, at least until you can satisfy them that you've taken enough measures and that they're in place for them to return. So really, Rebecca, disciplinary proceedings should be a last resort. And if someone has raised a health and safety concern in particular, and you do something which might be seen to be a detriment, for example, disciplining them and sanctioning them or reducing their pay, this could give rise to a successful claim potentially. So unfortunately, there's no easy answer when it comes down to whether, after all these measures, it could be said to be a reasonable belief on the part of the employee that they were in serious and imminent danger. But certainly don't just throw everything out of the window. It is a great starting point to have basically carefully followed the government guidance that is in place and trying your best to comply with all of that. Certainly then it might call into question the person's reasonable belief, as well as consulting carefully with them about their individual circumstances.
Okay, thank you. In the hospitality industry in particular, I understand that one of the issues that clients are coming across is that it's perhaps relatively straightforward to put safety measures in place in the workplace for an employer's own direct workforce. But how do they protect that workforce from third-party staff, such as contractors or agency workers, who in the hospitality industry, it's very common, will be required to be on site? I guess those staff could legitimately raise concerns about working with these third parties if they're not under the control of the employer. So how have we seen clients addressing this?
Yeah, this is a really tricky issue, obviously, and we have advised a 4-step approach. So step 1 is to check what requirements those third parties already have in place to ensure that their workforce are safe. Hopefully it will be similar and will provide comfort, but don't just be satisfied with them fobbing you off with saying, oh, yes, we've complied, no worries. You need to actually, you could ask them for their risk assessment, for example. You could ask them as to how they deal with their employees going to other premises, for example. Step 2 is to detail the safety requirements you would like them to take in a single document and ask those third parties to sign, confirm their understanding and the agreement to ensure that their personnel follow your safety measures. And step 3 is to make sure that you have all necessary signage and reminders around your workplace so that when third parties come onto the premises, they're reminded, like your staff, about the government guidance, the steps they need to take to stay safe, and of course, what symptoms of COVID-19 to be aware of and what to do if they're displaying the symptoms, so that you can basically get that person off the premises as soon as possible and reassure your own staff that you're doing the right thing. And step 4 is having some kind of reporting mechanism so that if anyone is concerned about measures being taken or about individuals, they can report the concerns, they can be dealt with, so your staff can also help you to monitor the third parties coming into the workplace. And I've also had one other thing that's proposed to me, which I thought wasn't a bad idea, about the fact that you can actually, anyone that comes onto the site, whether they're your staff or someone else's staff, to make a declaration to say that that day they're not suffering from any symptoms, or they don't believe they are, and they haven't come into contact with anyone who they think have been displaying symptoms. That, obviously isn't a legal document, but nonetheless, it's a way of at least perhaps flushing out those who might not be as certain about their own position.
Right, thank you. So moving on, homeschooling has been a hot topic during COVID-19. And now, of course, if that wasn't bad enough, we've hit the summer holidays. So we're seeing lots of employees, I'm sure, with continuing childcare issues, whether that's because they're still unable to call on grandparents due to their vulnerability, or they can't use nurseries, childminders, holiday camps because they're either no longer open or perhaps even no longer operating. What do we do with these employees if they're saying they can't come into work because of their childcare responsibilities?
Yeah, are able to at least explore all possibilities of their childcare arrangements with them to see if a solution could be found. So don't shy away from that. I mean, some people have been very nervous in saying, well, their childcare responsibilities, therefore I shouldn't ask. Absolutely not. You should ask. For example, you should drill down into the detail. If there's a delay in the nursery opening, for example, consider allowing them to work from home until then at least. A lot more nurseries are now opening, but sadly, as Rebecca, you've just said, some of them are not opening ever again because they've gone bust. And it's much more difficult than it sounds just to be able to find another nursery place. I do appreciate that, being a parent myself. So there's nothing wrong, as I said, with really delving down into the detail of that childcare arrangement, because you would do otherwise. If we weren't in COVID, you wouldn't just say, oh, it's fine that people can work from home and not find out if they've got young children what they're doing to deal with them. The other thing that I found quite helpful is to consider whether the partner of the employee or worker could assist in the childcare arrangement. So they perhaps could share the responsibility in some work part-time rather than one not coming into work at all. I certainly had one situation where the argument by the employee was, I'm terribly sorry, I can't come into work at all. My wife has to run flat out and she's being asked to do all sorts of things. Well, sorry, hang on a minute. Why should one employer suffer more than another? Consider allowing time off for dependents. That's a statutory right for a short period, and whether or not that should be paid, or whether she would rather say take annual holiday. Of course, that's of limited use, and you need to think about what you would do at the end of that. You probably have seen in the press that flexible furlough is now available. So if someone has already been furloughed, you could offer a more flexible arrangement to come back and work part-time, for example. And as a last resort, you could offer unpaid leave if they've used up, their dependents' leave and any other leave that they might have, or they may not want to use up all their holiday at once. Let's face it, that's not necessarily a holiday. So basically, a lot of things need to be taken into account because of the potential risks that this category might have.
Yes, absolutely. What if an employer doesn't want to utilise any of those options? I mean, is disciplinary action for failing to come into work even an option here?
I would really caution against it, because if an employee can't attend due to childcare commitments and that person's female, you could get into some tricky arguments about indirect sex discrimination. The reason for that is that despite these modern times, more women than men are still dealing with the large part of the childcare arrangements. And so you could find yourself in a very difficult position. So I would say that you probably would want to avoid being the test case in front of the tribunal on this point, and I would avoid really doing that at any cost if you can.
Sounds very sensible. Thank you. Now, we know that a lot of people are nervous about taking public transport. If an employee thinks that travelling to work is unsafe, is that a reasonable basis for them to refuse to attend work?
We sort of return a bit to the same argument that they might put, which is the health and safety argument, that they have a reasonable belief that they were in serious and imminent danger. And to be honest, this isn't helped by the fact that Boris made various statements about, don't go on public transport, it's dangerous, in the early stages.
Mm.
I think they're trying their best to address that, and obviously using face masks and taking precautions might help. But it's a good idea to explore with employees whether they could use other forms of transport to get to work. Obviously, that depends to an extent on your facilities. A hotel car park tends to be quite large, so maybe they could drive, cycling or walking, all of those things, perhaps car sharing, or even considering a minibus if you know that your employees are all living in close proximity to each other. You'd need to consider the route that the employee takes and whether that could be shortened or the number of changes minimised, and actually sort of try to work out for yourself whether, if someone has to do 4 changes and travel for an hour and a half to get to work, that might be reasonable as to why they might be concerned about public transport. If they've got 10 minutes walk and they're literally hopping on a bus, then you might again question whether that is a genuine concern that they're expressing. Consider whether to actually provide the worker with additional PPE, for example, a visor for travelling on public transport, which is above and beyond what generally is advised, which is, say, a disposable mask. And if none of these will persuade an employee, then we return to the option of furlough, perhaps taking leave. But I think this is an area where if you're allowing someone to travel outside rush hour, you're being flexible about the time that they're coming in, for example, and leaving, that you're doing your best to make inquiries that I think in these circumstances, you could probably ask them to actually come into work unless they are, a vulnerable category, or they've got, you can see that they're incredibly scared about coming in. So this is an area where I would definitely think about perhaps, not forcing them in, but strongly encouraging it if you've done all those steps.
Great, thank you. How about employers that are now having to deal with a workforce wanting to utilise their accrued annual leave, especially now that we're hitting the summer holidays? What are you advising in that regard?
Well, I think you have to be, fairly strict. You can't allow everyone to disappear off at the same time. And unfortunately, yes, there have been some people that haven't been taking leave at all. So you might have to operate a first come, first served basis, or a holiday rota of some sort where you're basically inviting them to submit their applications, perhaps unfortunately not allowing them to take 2 weeks off, but perhaps 1 week, and reassuring them that they can take some more time, towards the end of the year as well. I appreciate that might cause some problem for people who have term time arrangements, and obviously you'd need to look at that in the round. But you can actually, as an employer, require people to take holiday at certain times. And some employers that I know have actually already stipulated that even during furlough, so that they don't end up with the situation of overrun either in the summer or coming into autumn.
Great, thank you. And if staff do take holiday without permission, I'm sure you've come across that situation, is it the usual case of disciplinary action, even if, for example, they tell the employer they took this holiday because they needed to visit relatives that they haven't seen, since the beginning of lockdown due to COVID-19?
Well, I mean, we can all have our own stories, should I say, and I think that this is a circumstance where someone disappearing and being absent without authorization would almost certainly be a disciplinary issue. You can sympathise with them, of course, and if they were upfront about it and actually said in certain circumstances that I've dealt with where the employees are not yet back at work, then if they're able to work from abroad, that's a different matter. But just disappearing because of the fact perhaps that they haven't been allowed to take the holiday they wanted is completely unacceptable, as it would be always.
Right, thank you. So before we let you go, Laura, it would be really interesting to get your thoughts on the recent mini budget announced by the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, because I think that some of the measures might well be of assistance to our clients. So perhaps you could run us through this. I mean, first of all, it might be worth just touching on this flexible furlough scheme that we've seen come into force.
Yeah, I mean, I think the advantage of the flexible furlough scheme is definitely going to be that, businesses, it's all very well saying to businesses, hey, you can open on the 4th of July, no problem. But I'm sure that a lot of businesses are not necessarily prepared to be open, and more to the point that they're not as busy as they would have hoped. The advantage of the flexible furlough scheme is that you can basically decide on what employees are going to do, and not have them all on furlough and not doing anything. So, and you can do that on a week by week basis. So you could actually have a rotating workforce. One, that means that the workforce is retained, and two, it means that you're able to not have everyone in, and also able to claim some money back from the government. So I think it's a really good scheme, actually.
Brilliant. Does this tie in with the new job retention bonus that the Chancellor announced? And what is this?
Yes, it's a one-off £1,000 payment to businesses for each employee they reinstate to the workplace following furlough leave. What I'm not quite clear about is whether you can flexibly work someone who's still on furlough and still get the bonus. It's not quite clear, but I suspect it isn't that. I suspect you actually have to bring them fully back to the workplace. But one important thing is that it's payable to businesses. It doesn't have to be passed on to the employees. So this is sort of a potential windfall. However, you might have seen in the press that some businesses are making actually a bit of publicity out of the fact that they're not taking that bonus. And they're saying that they're, basically allowing the government to retain that if they've got a large workforce.
Yeah, very interesting. And what about the new Kickstart scheme that was announced? What does that consist of?
Well, I think this could be a really important area in businesses that are, able to encourage young people. And I do think the hospitality industry is very much one of those, because it's basically introduced a couple of new things. It's to help under 25s, and they will directly pay employers to create new jobs for 16 to 24-year-olds at risk of long-term unemployment. So quite a lot of people that I've heard of have basically turned down possibilities of university places or deferred them. And these people could be helped by actually working hard in the interim, as well as helping businesses. So for each job on the scheme, the Treasury will pay 100% of the national minimum wage for 25 hours a week, with employers able to top up that amount, as well as employer NICs and auto-enrolment pension contributions. And there's also some funding for traineeships, with the government providing funding for employers to offer work experience to trainees aged 16 to 24 at a rate of £1,000 per trainee. And furthermore, they're encouraging apprenticeships between the 1st of August 2020 and 31st of January 2021. And they're going to provide payments to employers in England who hire new apprentices. The payment will be £2,000 for employers who hire apprentices aged under 25, and £1,500 for those who are 25 and over.
Brilliant. Okay, so a real sort of twin approach there, trying to discourage employers from making redundancies by making that post sort of furlough payment, and then this raft of measures to try and encourage recruitment, particularly in the younger workforce, by the sounds of it.
Absolutely, which I think is very encouraging for the economy potentially, although maybe worrying for the older workforce. We'll see.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much, Laura, and thank you to everyone watching. We hope you found the webinar useful. If you'd like to speak to Laura or any of the team about the issues that we've discussed today, or indeed any of the challenges that you and your businesses are facing during this time, please do get in touch via the contact details that follow. Otherwise, thank you for watching and do stay safe.